Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Ask the Expert. My name is Ashley Baldwin. I work at the Department of Communications at the Pan American Health Organization. And this week, we're going to be talking about the ethics of clinical trials to find a vaccine and treatment for COVID-19. So I'm joined here today by my colleague, Dr. Carla Saenz, Regional Advisor in Bioethics at the Pan American Health Organization. Hello, Carla.
Hi, Ashley. How are you? How are you, favorite friends?
And as per usual, you can ask your questions that have to do with the ethics of clinical trials relating to COVID-19 treatments and vaccines in the comments section below, and then we'll endeavor to get to them within the next sort of 30 minutes to an hour. So when we talk about the ethics of clinical trials to find a vaccine and treatment for COVID-19, we need to keep in mind that the virus that causes COVID-19 is very new. That's probably one of the most standout features of the pandemic and something that's been coming up time and time again in these Ask the Expert sessions. We're learning about it every day. Sometimes our advice changes or is modified in accordance with that new research that's constantly evolving. I wondered if you could tell me, Carla, a little bit about why it's so important to do research during a pandemic.
Sure, Ashley. As you said, this is a new virus, meaning that we do not know much about a virus. We do not know how the virus behaves. We do not know who is at greatest risk. I mean, we have, at this point, we know a little bit, but there's so many details that we don't know. And most importantly, we do not know an intervention that is safe and efficacious to treat or to prevent the disease. We don't have a vaccine, we don't have a proven treatment, and we need to do research to find those and to also find the best way to deal with the disease and all its consequences.
So currently there's no proven treatments, there's no proven vaccine yet, although there's lots of trials that are continuing and that are fairly advanced. But when we talk about ethics as it pertains to that research that we know is necessary in order to find a treatment, and we know is necessary in order to find an efficient and efficacious vaccine for COVID-19, what do we mean? What does it mean for research to be ethical?
Right. So first of all, the process of finding a vaccine or finding a treatment that works is a long process. And necessarily the last part and an essential part of that process involves people. So we are concerned with ensuring that the treatment of those people that participate in studies is ethical. So those people are agreeing to be part of the effort of proving a treatment, proving a vaccine. And when we say proving a treatment or proving a vaccine, what we mean is that we do not know whether this treatment works or doesn't work. It may not work. It may even make things worse. So we want to make sure that those people that are generously contributing to something that's so valuable for the entire humanity are treated well, are treated ethically. And that's the focus of research ethics and in more specifically, the ethics of clinical trials.
Right. So I guess just because something works in theory and just because something might work in sort of animal trials maybe, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work when we start, rolling that out with humans. So
exactly.
I guess, yeah.
It's like a process when you try many things and then you start dropping the candidates. You start realizing that, oh, this looked great on the bench of the lab, but doesn't work with mice or doesn't work with larger animals. And you move only with certain substances that have been successful in the previous processes to actually conduct a research with people.
Right. So I guess this is why now for I think it's 23 of the vaccines that are being trialed for COVID-19, we're currently having these human trials just precisely to I guess, hopefully prove what you say that, because it works in theory and because it might have worked with animals or whatever it's been tested on prior to these trials. Now we need to make sure that when it's implemented in humans, it really is an efficacious vaccine.
Right, and it's remarkable how little we usually talk about this, because this is true for every single drug, for every single medicine, for every single intervention. It's only when we studied it with humans, with people, that we are able to find out whether it works or not. When we think about research, often we have these images of, you know, people with lab coats, just focused on, you know, just doing something on a bench and looking at the microscope. But that's just a very small part of the picture. Research ultimately, medical research is ultimately possible because of all those generous people that contribute as research participants and whose role is absolutely irreplaceable to find treatments and vaccines that work.
Right. So I guess it's quite, for me certainly, who doesn't work directly in ethics, it's quite a complex concept to get my head around. You know, when is something ethical, when is something not ethical, etc. You know, and of course we all each have our sort of personal values that we live up to, etc., etc. But who decides when research is ethical and when research isn't ethical?
We have established worldwide a very good system to handle your question. Every research protocol that involves people as participants is previously reviewed and approved, if it's good enough, by an ethics review committee. So this ethics review committee assesses the study in a very thoughtful way. It's not that you have a checklist and you can just, you know, if we would have a checklist at work, we wouldn't need a committee. You would need just one people to go through a checklist. But because we need to deliberate, we need to balance a number of things. Let me tell you, for example, is the level of risk reasonable? What is the study capable of producing any valuable results? If that's not the case, then the study is necessarily going to be unethical, because you will be exposing people to risk without any potential of benefit. So we go through many of these issues. We check, for example, an informed consent process. Is it good? Are people capable of voluntarily providing consent to this study? Are they being treated well after the study has finished? There are a number of things that we check, and we have really great ethical guidelines for each of these issues. But as I said, it's not a checklist, and we have a committee that assesses every single protocol.
So for all of these, I mean, I'm just taking the human trials for vaccines, as that's probably one of the most recent examples that most of our audience will be aware of. So for these 23 human trials that are taking place, will there have been a committee for each individual trial looking at all of those different factors that you mentioned?
Absolutely. And I would say at least one. Imagine that a study gets planned, for example, here in the US, and it gets conducted in 5 different locations, in 5 different countries. We would ensure that in each country there's a committee reviewing the study and checking that it is ethical.
We've had a question that has just come in, Carla, from Dan Epstein, who wants to know if there have been any ethical problems that we have seen in research in recent times. So I don't think he necessarily is referring to COVID-19, but maybe something else that you might be aware of, and whether all research is ethical now.
Well, we have a history. The history of research includes, unfortunately, a number of studies that were conducted unethically. People in the region may remember the Guatemala studies in the 1940s, when research participants were deliberately inoculated with syphilis. Or you may remember the studies that took a long period of time in Tuskegee, where people with syphilis were deprived of of the cure that was available at that moment to study the progression of the disease. Those are incredibly unethical studies. And it's not, of course, I cannot confidently, I cannot say with certainty that every study that gets conducted is conducted ethically, but I think we have a system in place to vet the studies that get conducted. And, you know, you journalists can relate to this. Probably, you know, what's the saying, like, if a dog bites a man, that's news, and if the man bites the dog. Right, the other way around. So, of course, if there's one unethical study, that goes to the media, but all the millions of studies that get conducted in accordance with the ethical studies don't make it to the news, because that's the standard, that's the norm. Yeah. And we have lots of people working to make that possible.
Right. And I think it's also important to mention that, you know, even with things like journalism, we have ethical guidelines. You know, sometimes they don't get followed. I think that there's plenty of examples of them not being followed, but I guess this is why it's so important, particularly when we're talking about healthcare and when we're talking about treatments and these kinds of studies where we're researching new medicines and new vaccines, to have these committees to make sure that things are ethical and that these studies are as safe as they can possibly be. Which brings me on to my next question, which is, sometimes, again, as someone not involved in medical research and health research, etc., the idea of, I guess, experimenting or carrying out research with human beings doesn't always feel ethical. Is it okay to do research with people? I mean, why is...
Yes, it's okay to do research. Doing research with people is absolutely indispensable to finding cures of diseases and to find vaccines that work. It's okay to do research with people, provided that it's done ethically, provided that we've checked that the risk is not excessive, that's appropriate, that the populations that are being asked to participate in research are not being chosen because we're trying to take advantage of them, that there's a fair distribution of risks and benefits. It's not that you're passing the risk to this group and then the benefits of the research will go to this other group, for example. So there are a number of things that we assess as part of an ethics review committee to make sure that research is ethical.
So I guess when we're choosing candidates, for example, because to follow up from that question, you know, something that is reported in the media, certainly historically, not in the context of COVID-19, thank goodness, is, you know, this surge of an anti-research movement, much like an anti-vax movement. And the idea that certain populations might be taken advantage of, you know, sometimes historically, things have been tested in certain regions and with certain people that might have been classified as more vulnerable in those regions. So how do we ensure that that doesn't happen? How do we ensure that research is moral, I guess, and that candidates are selected in an ethical way?
Right. So one thing that we have to remind ourselves is that excluding people from research means excluding them from the benefits that result from research. So I may have the best intention to protect some people. Imagine I'm like, oh, no, let's not do research with children because, oh, those poor children, they're so fragile, they cannot consent on their own. Imagine I think that, and I say, let's better exclude children from the research enterprise. But that means that we have a research enterprise that's not going to produce cures or vaccines that work on children because we didn't do the studies with them in the first place. But this is something that's very clear for the field now, but it's a young field. It was not, this was not as clear before. And there's still the impression that excluding people from research is a way of protecting them, while excluding people from research is an injustice. We are excluding them from, I mean, why are we gonna produce a cure that only works in some and not on others? Shouldn't we care about having cures, treatments, vaccines that work on everybody, on old people, on young people, on pregnant women? One thing that we rarely talk about is that of now, about 70% of the medicines that are routinely given to children have not been studied on children. And I don't think anyone will say that this is a good idea, but that's where we are now because we thought we were protecting the children, but we created a worse scenario that now we have the moral duty to fix. Right. By including those populations carefully, responsibly, proactively, not just like including everybody as, we need to ensure that the protections are in place for each of these groups.
Yeah, that's interesting what you say, because I guess when I think about human research, I think about all human beings being physiologically basically the same, and therefore a medicine that's going to work on, let's say a very healthy 45-year-old man would also work on a 7-year-old or on a 6-month-old baby, but that's clearly not the case. So, but then I guess you do have, as parents, how do you balance that kind of moral argument, wanting to protect your children and yet wanting medical treatments that are efficacious and that work for 7-year-olds, for 2-month-old babies who of course can be just as terribly sick and require effective medicines, and pregnant women? How should we really be doing research with populations that are so vulnerable? Is there any other way that we can be testing things on human subjects that are healthy and that maybe don't have the same vulnerabilities as someone who's very elderly, for example, or someone who's pregnant or a small baby? Or is there just no way around it?
Well, there's really no way around it unless we want to expose them to risk later when they're sick. And imagine you're sick, you're pregnant, and there's this medicine that works for others, and you'll have to assess, am I better off not taking the medicine and letting the disease progress, or am I better off taking the medicine, with all the risk that implies because it hasn't been studied on pregnant women? That's a terrible situation to be in. We'd be better off if we do the research with pregnant women from the beginning and take those baby steps that we take when we do research and have someone monitoring carefully the protocol, the research, the risk at each step, and taking the next step based on the lesson of the previous one. So we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we produce treatments and vaccines that are safe and that work for children and for pregnant women. And those are two groups that are often deprived of the benefits of research because they were not included in research in the first place. But they're groups that are very different, because one thing that is fundamental about children is that they're not capable of deciding on their own. They have a parent that will be part of the decision process. And of course, at some point, kids will develop that capacity to decide on their own, and the parent's role in the decision-making process will, will diminish. And we have ways of protecting children. Of course, parents have a huge role in the decision-making process about their participation. But because of this situation, we do see children as vulnerable in a way we do not see pregnant women per se as vulnerable. Imagine I get pregnant tomorrow. It's not that by being pregnant tomorrow I lost the capacity that I have today to assess whether a study has a reasonable level of risk or not. I still have that capacity, but it is both are populations on which it's more challenging to do research, for sure. Physiologically, there are characteristics that justify doing research with them.
Right. So we're here with Dr. Carla Saenz, the Regional Advisor in Bioethics at the Pan American Health Organization, talking about the ethics of clinical trials to find a vaccine and treatment for COVID-19. So if you have any questions about the ethics of the research that's going on as we speak now into medicines and vaccines for COVID-19, please don't hesitate to pop it in the comments section. This is your opportunity to ask Dr. Symes, and she'll answer. And we've had another question that has come in, and I want to relate that a little bit to what you've just said, because I think it's very applicable to the issue of pregnant women who of course have the capacity to choose just like any other adult woman. But there's certainly been, in my country of origin, there has been historically medicines that were used for pregnant women that led to, horrendous consequences for the unborn child. I have no idea about the background of those trials and things like that, so I don't know whether it was tested or it wasn't tested and what happened. But do you have any examples of recent ethical lapses in research?
Just trying to think of anything specific. I mean, you may be the case you I think are referring to the thalidomide.
Thalidomide.
Yes. Thalidomide. Sorry about my Spanglish. The problem in that case is that the research was not conducted. So here's what happens if you don't do research, say with children or pregnant women, and then say the drug got approved based on its results on adults, and then it gets given to children or to pregnant women. Well, that's a very risky thing to do. And if you give, and we're talking about a drug that is not proven for children or not proven for pregnant women. So I was talking earlier about all this system of protections that we have established to ensure safeguards for research participants. Because when you are participating in a study, by virtue of this being something that you do not know if it works or not, you're going to be bearing risks. So the problem, the serious problem is when we pass people those risks outside of the setting of research without any of the protections. So, and that's why it's so urgent to do the research with this, in all areas for these populations. Of course, it's easier not to do it and then just pass it, make it their problem, but that's not ethical.
Yeah. Okay. We've had another question, just bringing the conversation back to the vaccines for COVID-19. We've had a question from Kent Maurice, who's asked about priming for patients that then participate in these human trials. So is there anything that's done to these groups when they go in for these human vaccination trials, nutritional or immune boosters?
I am not an immunologist, and so I think that's a great question for an immunologist. But but
you'll have to come back, Kent. You'll have to come back.
And I have, I'm actually right here. I was just looking at all the summary of all the COVID vaccine trials. There's an array of vaccine candidates. We're trying so many different things. So I think even for an immunologist, it'd be hard to give the answer, a general answer to that question. And as of now, I have not had the opportunity to review any protocol of vaccine trial, which probably would put me in give me better understanding about that specific question.
But maybe along the same veins, and maybe this again isn't an answer for you, or isn't a question for you, but Carla, one would assume, a layperson like myself would assume that when someone is recruited into one of these clinical trials, there are certain precautions that maybe happen across the board. Can you talk us a little bit about what those precautions might be if I was to volunteer for a clinical trial, whether it be the COVID-19 vaccine or the COVID-19 or anything?
Right. So as I was saying earlier, when every protocol gets reviewed by an ethics review committee. And one of the many things that this committee does, and the committee brings expertise from different areas, including, for example, from immunology, if it's a vaccine study. One of the things the committee does is the committee tries to see if there are ways to minimize the risk and maximize the benefit. So we have a more favorable risk-benefit profile. For example, do we need to test this drug in so many people? Do we need that big of a dose? Do we need to give so many shots? And are there people that should be excluded? Say we're talking about a drug that gets eliminated through the kidney. Oh, shouldn't we exclude those that have, any indication or family history of kidney problems? So we do a very rigorous assessment like this. So what you as a potential research participant receive should be what we sometimes call a fair offer. It should be a proposal that it be reasonable for you to say yes or no. And that may depend on your values, on your interest, and on your time, right? In this proposal, we'll always say, hey, we're studying this, and these are the risks, and this is what we aim at achieving, and this is what it implies from you. So, hey, Ashley, you have to come to the clinic 3 times in the next month, and we expect that each visit will be 2 hours, something like that. So you have a sense of what this is like, and what are the risks of the study, and what type of people are being invited other than you to participate in this study. And we check that the selection is not based on discrimination or privilege, but really based on the objective of answering the research question in the safest possible way.
Are participants remunerated?
Yes. I mean, usually you have, you for your records, you keep a number of each participants have colleagues working on research. They always remember, oh, that was patient 1 and participant number 1 in our study. Sometimes there's this type of relationships too.
So we've had another question come in, and it's about how the research that's being carried out in the context of COVID-19. Let's take the vaccine again, because I think it's something that we're all very familiar with. How does that compare with the research that was conducted for the polio vaccine in the 1950s? What has changed and evolved, and what have we learned over the past 70 years?
Lots of things have changed from the 50s. For example, I've been talking a lot about an ethics review committee. The idea of having an ethics review committee, and something I haven't specified, is that this is an independent committee. So if you are the researcher, you cannot be part of the committee. Your team cannot be part of the committee. We need to ensure that this is independent from the research team. So that idea is from the 60s. So we were not doing that before the 50s. That was an idea that, if I remember correctly, was proposed in the second version of the Declaration of Helsinki of the World Medical Association. The first version of the Declaration of Helsinki is in 1963. So we were not doing that before. And it's very interesting because there are some intuitions that we had before that are captured in the Code of Nuremberg post-Second World War that are still important, but we've managed to put less weight on them. And one of them is informed consent. Many people think that, look, this is a research proposal. I'm inviting you to participate. And if you decide, if you give your informed consent, it's good, right? So as if research would be ethically okay just by virtue of participants voluntarily deciding if they want to take part of the study or not. But that's not true. Informed consent, ensuring voluntary participation in research, is one among many things that an ethics review committee will look at to make sure that the research is ethical. Like in many situations of life, we think like, sorry, it's not about you agreeing or not agreeing, but there's a cap. We cap the risk. We don't think that excessive levels of risk are acceptable, even if you were to accept that as an individual. Right. So we pay, and in the ethics review committees, we pay a lot of attention to informed consent processes. We want to make sure that people are not pressured to participate, that they're not coerced, that they're giving truthful information so they can make the best decision. But that's still one of the many things that we assess.
Right. So we're not relying on the individual themselves to be able to necessarily evaluate the medical risk of a trial, and then we don't stand back and say, well, you know, he said it was fine. Everyone's dead, but they said it was fine. There's also that independent committee will carry out that assessment of how risky is this objectively, and then when people are giving their informed consent, what are they really consenting to, and how aware are they of the risks around? Is that what we mean?
Right. So the committee will try to make sure that what is offered to potential research participants is something that's reasonable, that doesn't include an excessive level of risk or risks that are extraordinary for the benefits that you want to achieve in the study.
So we've had another question from Sydney Sines, who's talking about studying. Around the world, there's examples of a lot of bad studies that haven't given true information. How can we rely on a study? So I guess before we move into the stage of human trials, and I guess in many cases, animal trials, how can we rely that the sort of theoretical studies that have been conducted are producing, I guess, a solid argument for us moving forward into those subsequent stages?
Right. So when we talk about reviewing the ethics of the study, you may think, oh, that's just the ethics, right? And the science is in another pocket. But that's not true. Because when we talk about research with human participants, if the science is not right, we will not be able to learn anything out of this. So there will be no reason for anyone to participate in a study like this, in a study that's scientifically valid, because you would be exposing people to risks without any prospect of benefit, of learning anything out of this. So as part of the ethics review process, we scrutinize the science really carefully. And makes me think, you were saying before, oh, it's not the task of reviewing some details, is not passed to the potential participant, right? We think that's fair because some of these clinical trials, some of these protocols are very technical. And I don't think it'd be fair to expect anybody to have all the information to assess the risk and benefits based on the science. Say I give you, I don't know, 3 doses of medicine X. How would you know how, you need the science, you need someone, you need that broken down, because it's also a matter of justice. If that be the case, then what? Only the scientists would be able to participate in research? Only those that know? I mean, we want this to be an enterprise that's as fair, inclusive, transparent as possible.
Right. So this committee, say I were to take part in one of these trials, this committee is really there to make sure that I'm as protected and informed, expertly informed, as is humanly possible, even though I'm a journalist and, haven't studied science for the past, over 20 years.
Yes, and we all have our values, our preference, where some of us are more risk adverse than others. Some of us, like me, bike to work, and I have some colleagues that tell me I'm crazy. How could I do something like that, riding a bike every day in Washington, D.C., next to the cars? So we still have our differences, and I may think that a risk of a study makes perfect sense to me, but you may say, oh, no, I'm a little bit more for nervous, Nelly. I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
So that there's still that scope, but what we receive as potential research participants is something that has been vetted already.
Right. So we've had another question coming, Carla, and I don't know if it's one for you. So if it's not, we can move over it and save it for another week. But it's from Ken Maurice again, and he wants to know how you feel. And I guess by how do you feel, the implication is, what is the ethics around mandatory vaccinations for COVID-19?
Right. I think it's too early to talk about mandatory vaccinations for COVID-19 because we do not know. We don't have the vaccines, so we do not know how well they would work. It may be that the vaccines only work for a subset of the population, at least initially. So that there's a lot to find out. But I think this is more of a question about public health ethics, which is another area on which I work, and not so much about research ethics. But it's a question that's very important. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic really makes us think about basic ideas of public health ethics. We tend to act as if things would be ethically acceptable if they're voluntary and non-ethically acceptable if they're mandatory, if they're imposed on us. And that's not true. It's mandatory to wear a seatbelt when you're driving. We don't go around thinking that's unethical. We have conducted a thorough assessment and we've come to that conclusion. And I think with a similar assessment, we've concluded that many vaccines are or should be mandatory, and that's the situation of the vaccination schemes that we have, and we'll have to do that assessment, and more importantly, we'll have to revisit it again. A key idea in public health ethics is that if you can achieve the same public health goal in a way that is less burdensome for the population, you have to take that path. Right. But sometimes, there are periods in history when we can achieve goal X with little work, but then things get different. Things change, and then we can no longer achieve that same goal with that little burden, and we have to have a different strategy. So this is part of the discussion about a great topic on public health ethics, which is the ethics of vaccination.
And I guess as well, we often look at public health interventions, particularly if we're not sort of experts in the field, which I'm not, as something that's put in place to protect me, to protect my health, when there's actually a lot of interventions which, by me getting vaccinated as a healthy adult woman, I'm not just protecting myself from possible, awful vaccine preventable illnesses, but I'm also protecting people around me, people that I'm close to, that I know, that I care about, the community who might not, for medical reasons, be able to have some of those vaccines, who might be immunologically
compromised. Yeah.
Thinking in Spanish again, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's a lot of measures that aren't just for me, but that are for our community as well. And I guess when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines, there's going to be a lot of the same sort of ethical conversations around getting vaccinated as something that's going to protect you from COVID-19, but it's also going to protect everyone else around you and hopefully stop this pandemic in its tracks.
Right. I think you've identified an essential issue. It's one thing if we're talking about Carla deciding whether Carla wants to get dialysis or not. Okay, because if I have acute kidney disease and I don't get dialysis, I'll die, but the problem stays with me. But when we're talking about infectious diseases, it's not just my health, my well-being that is at stake, it's everybody else's. So we have, unfortunately, the discussion about these issues not always take that into account. Yes, it's a vaccine that'll go in my arm, but it's for the health of everybody else. And I'm putting others at risk if I don't get the vaccine. And some people may even die because of that. So we have An essential idea in public health ethics is that we have to do an analysis that takes the population into account. We're very good at analysis that involves just individuals, me, myself, my my stuff, my body, but sometimes it's just not about that.
Yeah, and I guess it's the same with, the public health measures as well. We're staying home and out of restaurants and coughing into the crooks of our arms and wearing our masks where they're mandated, not just to protect us, but to protect everyone else as well. So I think it's an important point to keep in mind when we talk about the ethics around vaccines, treatment, and also the public health measures that a lot of us are having to implement in the context of COVID-19. We've had another question, and again, this is about this ethical review process that takes place, this committee. Is that review process universal? Does it take place in the same way from country to country, or does each country decide what that process is going to look like? So, for example, if a vaccination is being developed in X country, is the ethical process around the human trials for that vaccine going to be the same as Y country that might be in a different continent, for example?
Right. So ethical values, ethical principles are universal. We have international ethical guidelines for the content of that review. But the process may still differ a little bit in each country. Hey, some countries say that by law, the committee needs to have over 10 people. Some countries allow smaller committees. Some countries require a lawyer and a bioethicist in each committee. Some countries require that you submit in paper, that you submit in. So we do have variations in the process, but we also have guidelines about the key elements of the process that should always apply. And in terms of how good we are at doing the actual review, it's a learning process. It can be very difficult at the beginning. We train our members of the committee, but you learn a lot as things go. And from my role, I also see a fantastic learning process in our region. I think we have really, really improved our capacities to do a better review. We have committees that have more capacity. They're more in tune with the international guidelines. We have health authorities that are more involved, supporting them as needed. So we're improving a lot, I think, at all levels, because even from the more academic side of the field, as research ethicists, trying to figure out what's right and wrong, and we're improving too, because I mean, if you think of or specific guidance, for example, for including pregnant women in research, it's now so much better than it was 10 years ago. So we're all learning to do better.
Right. But I guess, to bring it back into very basic terms, can I trust that a trial that's being conducted in one place is going to be as ethically vigorous as a trial that's being conducted in another place, and therefore that the results of those trials are going to be just as reliable no matter where they've come from? And I say this particularly because, we do have these 23 vaccines from various places that are going through human trials at the moment. As someone who will hopefully be consuming one of those vaccines in the not too distant future so that I can live my life, can I trust that any of those vaccines, if they've been through that trial process and they've been determined to be effective and efficient, that they are as safe, whichever one I get?
Right. So we have international standards for clinical trials that specifically for clinical trials on drugs and devices, called GCP, Good Clinical Practices, include the ethics review. And as I said, we're only thinking about research now, but research happens regularly. And research is, and has been for the last, over 10 years, 20 years perhaps, and international enterprise. That means that the majority of drugs that go through trials are not just studied in one jurisdiction, but in several places at the same time. We talk about multi-site trials. So the job of ensuring that the same standards, the same rules are followed all over, that job is not one that started with COVID. And of course, there are also some relevant legal variations. In some countries, by law, you're not allowed to enroll a 16-year-old without the permission of the parents. In some countries, you are, with some provisions. So there are some little details here and there. But I think another important aspect of your question is like, what do I do as someone that would like to contribute to a study? How do I know that this is something, that this is a study that I should consider participating in? So when you get invited to participate in a study, you start an informed consent process. It's not just a piece of paper, it's a process where you have a dialogue with whomever is inviting you to participate. You can ask questions, and as part of the informed consent process, you're given some material, and you can see what's the ethics review committee that approved this study. And they usually say, you have any question, you can contact the committee, and you can see, oh, this has been registered publicly. So there are a number of things that you can see to check, that you can do to check that this is a good one.
Okay, that's good to know. That's good to know. And I'm just going to ask you one final question, Carla, before we go, and it's probably quite a controversial one. So as we've mentioned throughout this chat, COVID-19 is a new disease caused by a new virus, and I think we can safely say that everyone in the world at this point is affected in some way. A lot of us are on lockdown still, et cetera, and we're really reliant on the development of treatments, and particularly on the development of a vaccine, for us being able to go back to normal, for want of another way of putting it, a better way of putting it. Now, let's say, for example, that in order for a vaccine that's looking very hopeful to tick the final box, I need to test it on 10,000 people, or a huge number of people. Is it okay, within the context of the pandemic, to do that research with people without their consent? If gaining that consent and going through this process of the conversations, et cetera, that you mentioned, means that it's going to be delayed however many months, and the rest of the population of the world are going to have to stay here waiting in our houses for that to take place.
No. So there are situations. There are situations, and they don't have anything to do necessarily with an emergency, a public health emergency, in which we think it is okay to do research without consent. So it is, there are some situations in which a waiver of consent is appropriate. And again, this is not just a specification for a pandemic. So if we're doing a study that has like great social value, and of course a pandemic, would count for that. That is minimal research. Say a study with samples that were collected already, and very, very minimal risk, and the risk is only informational, and it would really not be plausible to go reach people and that provided those samples and ask for their consent again. Then in that circumstance, we would say that a waiver of consent is appropriate, and the investigator should explain why these three criteria apply to the committee. The committee will assess, but I don't think that's going to be true. I mean, with a vaccine study, because it's still a substance, and I don't, that would not be described as minimal risk.
Right, right. Well, that's good to know. And then it's good to know that there's all of these committees and things in place so that we can ensure that when we do hopefully get a vaccine and a treatment for COVID-19, it's not going to be at any kind of awful human cost, or there's no dreadful discrimination that's been involved. And that also people that want to volunteer for these human trials know that they're also as safe as they can possibly be, and that there's all of these systems and processes in place to protect them, you know, if informed consent isn't enough. And you're right, if you're not going from scientist to scientist, informed consent, of course, isn't going to be enough, because we're not really going to know what we're consenting to. So thank you so much for taking the time to have a conversation with us today. I think it's been hugely useful. I don't know if there's anything else that we've missed out. I think we've had quite a few questions, so we've gone over pretty much everything, but we'll be back next week, same time, same place, to talk about another aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic. So please don't hesitate to join us then. Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Sainz.